Welcome to Educating to be Human, a podcast where we'll explore what it means to be human in today's world at the intersection of education, technology, and culture. I'm your host, Lisa Petrides, founder of the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education. Each week, I'll speak with people who are supporting transformative change in education today. That is, ordinary people creating extraordinary impact. Thank you very much for listening. Welcome, folks, to episode 10, the final episode of our very first season of Educating to be Human. I'm your host, Lisa Petrides, and I have had an incredible time exploring how we might educate and inspire transformative change in today's evolving cultural and societal landscape. While we're wrapping up this season, I'm excited to share that we'll return soon with fresh voices and new ideas for season 2. And to close out this season, I am honored to speak with Jody Lewen. She's president of Tamalpais College at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center in San Rafael, California. Jody is a visionary leader and passionate advocate for equitable access to education, particularly within the prison system. Over her remarkable 20-plus year tenure, she has worked tirelessly to expand higher education programming at San Quentin, empowering incarcerated students to build skills, confidence, and a deep sense of purpose. In today's conversation, we'll unpack the realities of higher education in prison, the challenges of fostering creative, inclusive learning spaces within correctional facilities, and the profound impact education can have on the lives of incarcerated students. Together, we'll explore how a higher education within the prison system creates vital connections between the inside and outside world and holds the potential to reshape society. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you. So happy to be here with you.
Jody, when we hear about prison education programs, whether in the media or elsewhere, the conversation often centers on recidivism as the primary measure of success. It's an easily digestible metric, but from what I understand, it doesn't really capture the complexities of what's happening in these programs or in the lived experiences of incarcerated students. At Tamalpais College, how do you approach the idea of measuring success? What does success look like for your students? And how do you move beyond the limitations of recidivism as a measure of impact?
You know, the question about success is a really interesting one, because what I always tell people about recidivism is that you can freeze to death under a bridge and not recidivate. And recidivism tells you almost nothing about the person's well-being except for the fact that they're not in prison. And the challenge is that really, in general, metrics that are applied to in-prison programs almost by definition really refer to reducing the burden or the cost to the society or to the taxpayer. They
Exactly.
traditionally have nothing to do with the well-being and the thriving of the individual student or person. You know, I would say one of the greatest challenges of the field really is helping people understand incarcerated students as students and as people. And so in a sense, that is the challenge and the tension that you're constantly confronting when you work in this space. You know, when you evaluate programs, when you talk about its value, when you fundraise, you know, whatever it is that you're doing, it's really hard for people to hold in mind the idea that the incarcerated college student is a person, is an ordinary person, right? And that they have needs and that they are also entitled to the same benefits of education that any other person would, and that they're also interested in those. One of the things we often find that people are interested in and often assume about the work is that its purpose is to change people, right? And of course, education does always change people. But what's interesting is that it can be really challenging to talk about change and also steer clear simultaneously of sort of, you know, the reductionist cliches of change, right? So the stereotypical concept would suggest that the person comes to us broken, uneducated, maybe even immoral. And then they go through, in this case, the college, and it's almost like a car wash or something. And they come out on the other end, and they're nice, and they're smart, and they're employable. They're not scary, And so we're constantly sort of struggling to manage those cliches and to resist this reduction of what's happening in the program, to those sort of simple stereotypes. And yet, we often, of course, are eager to talk about the change that is taking place. And so, one of the sort of challenges that we straddle often is being a school and thinking like a school, thinking, about we exist to serve our students and to ensure their personal and professional and economic and every form of well-being and success, in life. And yet, a lot of our key stakeholders, at least initially, really couldn't care less, to be frank, right, about the well-being of the individual, except to the extent that they pose a threat or a burden. And so what we try to do is to be ourselves, to run the program as educators and run the program in terms of what we believe is in the best interest of the student, but we're also constantly translating, right? And so we're finally about to launch a study that will capture recidivism data, in perpetuity, so that we can answer that question, which is the one thing anybody asks us about. The one thing nobody asks us about is, how do you know your students are learning, right? But when we became
Right.
independent college, one of the beautiful things was that we were required to create a chief of institutional effectiveness and research position and to start generating data on learning assessment and to ask that question about not only how are students doing, how do you know they're learning, but to gather data which would then help us continually improve the program. So we have a really robust learning assessment program going on now, where we're also trying constantly, as many others do in this field, to identify patterns and then to sort of out of those patterns devise strategies for supporting students better.
That's great. When did you start this with the longitudinal study? How long before we have some data?
Well, it's interesting. The longitudinal study, the main focus of that is going to be educational and professional development, mental and physical health, and civic engagement, which are the outcomes that we care about. How are students doing over time, in educationally, professionally, how are they engaging with their community and, at large, and how are they doing?
Which, as you just described, those are the things that we would hope for in any kind of higher education program, whether it's in a prison or not. Those really are the goals. I would love to hear a little bit about what initially drew you to work in prison education.
It was a very accidental career path for me. I was on a very conventional academic track and sat down one day at a conference next to somebody who had helped to start this program a couple of years earlier. And I got just interested listening to her describe the program. And it turned out there was a fellow in the rhetoric department at Berkeley, where I was a grad student at the time, who was teaching with the program. And I ended up getting in touch with him and co-teaching a communications class. That was actually the spring of 1999. So when I heard about it, I got excited. I had been in academia my entire adult life, but had really been trying to sort of reconcile the world that higher education sort of pulls you into and the rest of the world and its needs. And so I guess when I heard about this college inside San Quentin that was run just by volunteers, and at the time was the only on-site degree granting program in the entire California state prison system, it just appealed to me. I mean, it just sounded like the convergence of many of my interests. And then once I got involved, I just loved it and got really hooked.
So when we think about, well, when I think about a prison education program, we don't quite know what that looks like, right? We, as somebody who's been in the higher education field and worked in universities, we kind of have a sense of what a college is like. So I wonder if you could describe prison is not necessarily a place that many people think of, or that it's going to be offering education programs. So I'd love for you just to describe a little bit about the prison education program, what it looks like, how one gets admitted, are there requirements? Like, for those of us who do know a bit about higher education, and for those of us who don't, it would be great to just sort of have an understanding of what that looks like.
So higher education and prison programs vary a lot in a number of ways, depending on the type of institution, the state, the schools that are involved. But at San Quentin, the way Mount Tamalpais College operates, anybody with a GED or a high school diploma is eligible to enroll. So we're not screening people based on age, length of sentence, commitment offense, time left to serve. And we're also not screening for academic skill level, right? So if they have the GED or high school diploma, they can get on our wait list, and it's basically first come, first serve. No fees or tuition. We'll give the students the school supplies, lend them the textbooks. It's really intended to be as accessible as possible in every way. About 90% of our students are not ready for college level, say, composition when they arrive. So most will spend about a year in the college prep math and writing program. And so we sort of pride ourselves on being as inclusive as possible, but also really pursuing a really high standard in terms of the academic rigor of the program. So we're sort of trying to be a cross between the ethos of the community college system, for example, and the small class size and academic rigor traditionally associated with a small liberal arts college. But so it really, in terms of the space, it's actually San Quentin is almost like an archaeological dig spatially, because it's lots of buildings from different eras that have been built kind of almost on top of each other. There's an education building, which is really three different buildings sort of thrown together. And we have different number of classrooms depending on the time of day and the day of the week. And we run about 20 classes each semester. So they're all meeting about at least twice a week. And students show up. Everybody's got a full-time job in the prison, but they show up for afternoon classes and or evening classes, which run 6 days a week. It's interesting. I mean, materially, it's a very, I don't know, there's something kind of barren about a prison, to say the least, in a lot of respects. But the energy, on the other hand, it is really fantastic. So it's a funny paradox, because the prison yard is like a very, very scrappy, like a city park that's very, very run down.
Right, right.
And materially, there's not a lot, but the atmosphere is remarkably positive and relaxed and much more, I think, friendly than people would imagine it.
Well, what are some of the unique challenges that you face when implementing educational programs in this setting?
I would say there are two categories of challenge. One is just the environment of the prison. The logistics can be overwhelming. And primarily, I mean, part of it is that you have to have every single thing cleared. You have to have permission to bring in everything and everyone that you bring in or out of the prison. But it's also, the prisons are very complicated bureaucracies with a lot of different people with a lot of different attitudes and motivations and skill sets. And so it can be very chaotic. And I think actually the chaos and the disorganization of the prison, their difficulties, for example, with internal communication, can be some of the most stressful aspects of the environment. You show up having been told classes are running, and then they're canceled, or you're told they're canceled and then it turns out you could have run. Getting information to and from students is incredibly challenging. And you develop strategies. You find ways to work around those things. You work really hard building relationships with the staff and the administration so that you can ideally work together to overcome those. But I would say, the other big challenge is the sort of earlier educational experiences of the students. So many people had severely disrupted early educational experiences, and often all the way through. Not everybody. I mean, it depends on the individual, but there are a huge number of people who were in schools that were not great. In some cases, whether or not the school was great, the student at the time was not in a position to learn. I mean, so many people have grown up around so much chaos, violence, hunger, poverty, so many different variables at home and in the community and at school that made it extremely difficult to learn. I would say probably 100% of students in prison are, by definition, trauma survivors. So they're dealing with all sorts of emotional and psychological challenges, which often can, not only in the present, but often in the past, have also interfered with learning. So when people arrive in the classroom, in a prison, often they're carrying a lot. They've been through a lot and they've missed a lot. And each person is different. So, the challenge is really creating systems and programs and a classroom environment and climate and a curriculum that will meet the needs of every individual student.
Right. So, how do you assess these students, or what does completion look like? And can you remind me what actually do the students do? They get an associate's degree when they finish?
Exactly. It's a liberal arts associate's degree. It's interesting. Well, so first of all, we do assessments in math and in writing and place students based on those. Most people will place into the college prep math or writing classes in the beginning and spend about a year there. So the process when students are new, when they first come to a new student orientation, is that they will be scheduled for an assessment in both math and writing. And the results of those assessments will determine what class they're placed into. And as I mentioned, most will start out in the college prep math and writing programs and spend on average about a year there before they go into the credit classes. But we also work with students on understanding more broadly what their needs are and what their concerns are. So students will do sort of an educational autobiography, for example, and they'll also conference with staff so that we can really get a sense of how they understand their needs and also any challenges that they anticipate that we can help with proactively. So ideally, our goal is always to be communicating with the student from the beginning, to be in conversation with them so that things they already, sense might be issues or things that arise just in real time are things that we can, immediately talk about. And so we have a learning.
So, in a lot of ways, this sounds just like what we would do at a community college, right? Or any good higher education environment where there's really an emphasis on student services. In addition to the academics, the student services really are just as, in some cases, just as important as factors in if a student will be successful or not.
Well, no, that's exactly right. And that is precisely what we are emulating, right? The idea is that students feel comfortable and know us, we know them. They trust us enough to come to us with challenges or problems. But also, what we found is that over time, in any setting, if a student is in dialogue with faculty or staff about how things are going, they also develop a conceptual vocabulary and a comfort level with reflecting and communicating about how they're doing and what their needs are. And that I often find is as important as the actual sort of pedagogical systems and things like that. So we're in conversation with students continuously. We have a specialist who can work with identifying students with learning disabilities and who will then also work with faculty simultaneously to make sure that the student is getting the support that they need and that the teacher understands what's going on, kind of helping the student and the teacher to communicate. But we've found in many cases that I don't know what I thought in the beginning. I think I always sort of imagined that, that one either had a learning disability or not, right? I mean, when we see now, I think most academics or most educators understand that these things exist on a continuum. But in addition, I think I've learned a tremendous amount about how often challenges are psychological and how even learning disabilities can have psychological dimensions and even psychological origins. We deal a lot with, for example, math phobia, just
Of course.
feeling
Yes.
terrified. And being terrified in a classroom can shut your brain down. We've really done a lot of work just to understand where students are coming from, but we've also done a lot of work on creating an environment where people are simply able to relax. Because we've found,
Hmm.
if people have the chance to get to know their teachers and the staff and trust them, then they're going to relax. They're going to be more comfortable. And in many cases, it's going to be 1,000 times easier for them to think. And so, in
Right.
addition to all the assessment and the supports, we're also just very aware of the role of trust in learning.
And speaking of teaching, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your teachers and who they are. I think a lot of your teachers are volunteers,
Yeah. Yeah.
primarily. So, how do you train faculty to teach this kind of population? Is there specific training and development that's necessary for them to teach within the prison system?
Some of the training is just understanding the prison, understanding the rules and regulations and culture, from the standpoint of the staff and administrators, so that we don't create conflict with the institution. The teachers also need to understand where their students live, what they're dealing with in their everyday lives, and certainly ways in which, if we don't understand the logistical and the cultural context in which they're living, we can, make things worse rather than better. I think that there are certain principles, for example, of universal design. There are just certain basic categories of knowledge related to making the classroom as inclusive as possible, which a lot of teachers remarkably have not been exposed to in other contexts. Most of our teachers are either professors or graduate students at the various colleges and universities in the Bay Area. So Stanford, Berkeley, USF, San Francisco State, Davis, sometimes Santa Cruz. They're sort of from that whole ecosystem. And what's interesting is how rare it is for students like the folks at San Quentin with the educational backgrounds and the psychological histories and social histories that they have to make it onto those campuses, right? And so theoretically, we would expect teachers to be able to support a broad cross-section of students in their classes, but very often they just haven't. And I have to say, one of the things that is really interesting about faculty training for the prison context is what we find is that teachers bring a lot of that skill and knowledge and information back to their main campus. And a lot of them talk about how much it helps them there, how they recognize needs or challenges in their home classrooms that they didn't understand or didn't notice before.
So, the faculty themselves are going through a learning process that they're using to improve on their own teaching.
Exactly. Well, and ideally, one of the positive secondary effects of a program like this is that those home campuses become even more hospitable to students with unconventional backgrounds, not just with, criminal records, which is also important, but students who just may not have traveled a conventional pathway and may have, needs that are similar to this community.
Oh, and I also wanted to ask you how many students a year are actually in your programs? What percentage of the population at San Quentin?
I think today San Quentin has a total population of about 32 or 3,400, and we have close to 300 students enrolled at any given time. And there's turnover, right? People parole, they transfer, so new folks are coming in each semester, but at any given time, I'd say it's about 300.
I would love to hear any examples you may be able to share of those students who have demonstrated some type of significant changes through their educational experiences at San Quentin, whether it's about recidivism or anything else that you might want to offer.
In terms of, change that I've seen, what I think of is students' accounts of their experiences in school, not so much just what I've witnessed, but really the experiences that they relay. And some of the patterns that I often hear are, for example, students talk a lot about the impact emotionally and socially of developing a comfort level in the classroom setting, right? Interacting with peers and teachers. Developing communication skills, critical thinking skills is also tremendously meaningful and powerful in terms of one's own self-image and self-esteem, right? There's a lot of metacognitive ability that comes through being in school. So I find that students often talk about the value of being able to reflect on their own life experiences, and particularly the knowledge that you acquire in classes, psychology, sociology, government, whatever it is. You often, I think, developing the concepts that help you make sense of your own life experience is also really transformative. You have some perspective and some framework for thinking about, what you've been through. But I think often there's something about being in college, in prison, and having these powerful, positive experiences independently, intellectually, but also in relationship with peers and teachers and others that stirs or sort of engenders a very powerful desire to, I guess what some people call give back. to be a
Hmm.
force for good, to stop young people from, making what they regard as the mistakes they made earlier in their lives, or to be aware of other options that they didn't see or weren't aware of earlier in their lives. And also, I think people are really interested in just that theme of repair, of what can I as an individual do to make my family, my community, the society better, smarter, healthier, more inclusive. And so, a lot of the students who I've known while they were inside and then after they came home, and there are hundreds of them now, a lot of them are working in fields like social work, working with addicts or homeless people, or, advocacy. They're really interested in public policy, a lot of people in the arts, some people in philanthropy or technology or business. But very often, I feel like one of the common threads is that desire to actually have a positive impact on the society.
Right. We didn't talk in the beginning a little bit about what Mount Tamalpais College is. And it's my understanding that you are at this point a fully accredited junior college. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How common is that?
So, as far as I know, we are the only on site degree granting independent accredited college inside a state prison. For a couple of decades, we were an extension site of Patton College, then later Patton University. And the Prison University Project was formed to provide material support to that program. And basically, over time, that program kept growing, the Prison University Project kept growing. And eventually, for a variety of reasons, which is a long story, we decided we wanted to become an independent college. So, just in the last 3 or so years, we went through that process of building the infrastructure required to be an independent school, and then achieved accreditation just a couple of years ago.
Well, that's great. It makes me wonder, like, what are some of the critical policy changes or advocacy efforts that could support the growth of and the success of prison education programs like Mount Tamalpais College?
I think for many decades, people assumed that what was needed was funding. And we're seeing funding, however inadequately, start to come back. For some states, the Pell Grants have been critical. Those were just reinstated last summer. And there's other public funding available now. The problem is that there is no real consensus in terms of quality standards for programs inside. And so I feel like the things that are most important aren't necessarily specific pieces of legislation. It's much more institutional policy and procedure, oversight, accountability, standards that I think are really where I would be most inclined to shine light. I think that faculty and staff and administrators at the individual campuses that are now, setting up programs inside or running them, really need to look at what they're doing in the prison, as and the students who they're serving in the prison is entitled to every service that their main campus students are entitled to, and they need to hold themselves accountable to that. I think part of the problem is that a lot of schools are under a lot of pressure financially, and a lot of institutions have begun to approach the in-prison programs as a potential source of revenue, right? So,
Mm.
apportionment funding, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's actually what I'm most concerned about. And the problem is, it's a mindset, but it's also a question of what will compel the school to invest the resources that are required to do this work well. Because if you're doing the work well, it's not going to generate revenue for your main campus. You're actually going to be looking for other sources of funding aside from the apportionment funding. Those are the conversations I'm most eager to see happen.
Yeah, and those are hard conversations because, how do you address and combat the bias and the stigma that society often attaches to the whole idea of incarcerated individuals? Do they deserve the same kind of education and services that somebody who's not in the prison system should? And
Yeah.
that's still very much a heated debate. And I'm wondering what you would want those folks who have those views. What would you want them to hear about what actually happens in prison education programs?
The most powerful way to really communicate with someone who has misgivings about whether or not people inside should have access to education is really to bring them inside, for them to actually meet people who are enrolled in college or who have been enrolled in college and in prison and are now out. I mean, I think It's really about meeting the person as a human being. It's very hard to argue abstractly about the humanity of an individual person. I think that the humanization is something that happens through proximity, I think, and context and interaction. But I think that the more people understand the life histories, the context and the pathway that a lot of people in prison have traveled, it's not that people inside haven't, in many cases, obviously done harm, but the point is that there's a whole story there. There's a whole person there, right? And I think that what you want and need people to understand is that folks inside are still alive, right? They still have hopes and dreams and potential. So there's, just understanding them as human beings. But there's also, I think, what you do want people to understand is the impact that incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people have on others and can have. The majority of incarcerated people have children, and the vast majority are coming home sooner or later, right? So there are a lot of self-interests on the part of the society at large to giving people the opportunity to develop an education and prepare to live a stable and satisfying life.
I love that, and I think there's a sense, and we've talked about this before, about how in some ways society doesn't want to give people a second chance.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I remember in my early years working at San Quentin, first teaching and then running the program, just having the experience over and over again of talking to someone who, in many cases, just in casual conversation, referred in passing to an early childhood experience that was unimaginable to me. Like I had always sort of assumed, well, everybody had somebody reading them a book at night, right? When they were little, everybody had somebody tucking them in, right? Or everybody had, all right, maybe not parents, but grown-ups raising them, right? And then you get to know the world of the prison and the life histories of people inside. I mean, there's a tremendous amount there that, the average person on the outside can't even really fathom.
I'm wondering if there are things that you think, sort of the general public, right? The people that you're talking about, what they could learn from these experiences of the incarcerated individuals that might actually help to foster a more empathetic and understanding society. Do you have a sense of that?
One thing that's evolved with us as a college and as a community over time in terms of understanding our own mission is that I think we've really come to believe that aside from delivering a high quality education to our students, another critical, not just responsibility, but also opportunity for us is really amplifying the voices of our students while they're inside, when they come home, so that they can make their voices heard and register in the minds of, the general public, right? That the people can hear from them, learn about them, and understand both them as human beings, but also all the ways in which they can contribute to building a healthier and more sustainable and equitable society. But so we've gotten really interested in the whole realm of communications as a dimension of our work, where narrative change and storytelling is often how we describe it. But we've gotten really interested in the sort of extracurricular life of the program and its potential also to build connections of familiarity and support between the inside world and the outside world. And I think that there's tremendous potential there in terms of really transforming the society. I think it's that understanding of people who are in prison as having thoughts and ideas and experience and knowledge and expertise that's really kind of what we want to express and communicate.
Great. Thank you, Jody, for such a beautiful conversation here and really helping us think about understanding how we as a society need to really recognize the human and the potential, the humanity and the potential of those who are incarcerated, and actually, in doing so, ourselves become more empathetic and understanding in this way. Thank you for such a terrific conversation. I really appreciate it. And is there any last message that you want to leave with folks who are listening about the importance of supporting education in prisons? Or is there an ask in terms of what folks could do to be involved with?
I mean, I would say for educators, really, I encourage people to look at a map, find out where the closest prison is. Chances are, at least in California, but also in a lot of other states, there are prisons around. I just encourage people to educate and inform themselves about the institutions around them and what may be going on there that can use support or guidance. But I also encourage faculty and staff and administrators on college campuses to find out what support services are available on their main campus for formerly incarcerated people who might be enrolling or seeking to enroll, because it really is truly like landing on another planet for somebody who's done time arriving often on a conventional college campus. And if there's an office or a person that just has a shingle out, or word just gets around, you can come talk to me. I'm not going to be scared of you. That can be the difference between persisting and dropping out or never enrolling. So I'm always really grateful when people take an interest in that angle as well.
A terrific piece of advice for those who are working in higher education today. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the show this week. This has been Lisa Petrides with Educating to be Human. If you enjoy our show, please rate and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can access our show notes for links and information on our guests. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at edu2behuman. That is EDU to be human. This podcast was created by Lisa Petrides and produced by Eleni Theros. Educating to be Human is recorded by Nathan Sherman and edited by Ty Mayer.